Mortarion, also known as the Pale King, the Death Lord, or the Prince of Decay, after he turned to Chaos, was one of the original 20 Imperial primarchs created by the Emperor of Mankind. He was given command of the Death Guard Space Marine Legion on the arrival of the Emperor to his homeworld of Barbarus, but he turned to the service of Chaos during the Horus Heresy. At present, Mortarion is the greatest demon prince of Nurgle and the demon primarch of the Death Guard Chaos Space Marines. He recently returned to Imperial space for the first time in 10,000 standard years, when he led the forces of the Plague God in the invasion of the realm of Ultramar during the Plague Wars. When the 20 primarchs of the Space Marine legions were scattered across the galaxy in a mysterious accident, one came to rest on the planet Barbarus, a world wreathed in poisonous fog where the most advanced technology was that of steam power. The pre-industrial population of the world was split into two groups: the controlling warlords, inhuman necromancers with fantastic warp-derived powers, and the human settlers who had been trapped on the planet millennia before and were now forced to eke out an existence essentially as farmers in the poison-free valleys of the planet, fearing the wrath of the necromantic overlords and their foul creations. The Primarch child was taken in by the most powerful of the overlords, who found him amongst the corpses of a battlefield where he had been engaged in one of the endless conflicts he fought with the other overlords. The infant Primarch was screaming and wailing where a normal child would have suffocated and died long before. The High Overlord, Nikaea of Barbarus, took the child in with the intention of creating a son and heir, naming him Mortarion, Child of Death, in the local Barbarian dialect of High Gothic. Mortarion was kept by the High Overlord in a small tower, positioned at the limit of even his superhuman tolerance to the toxins in the air, while Nikaea moved his own fortress to the highest peak of the world, beyond where even Mortarion could go. He trained the child, who had a highly keen intellect and voracious appetite for knowledge. Mortarion learned everything from battle doctrine to arcane secrets, from artifice to stratagem. However, the young Primarch's questions began to turn towards subjects the Overlord did not want to talk about, namely the pitiful creatures in the valleys that the many warlords preyed upon for corpses to reanimate and bodies to warp. Finally, knowing he would be unable to find the answers he desired from his adoptive father, Mortarion broke out of the fortress that had been his home and prison after killing several guards stationed at the gates of the fortress and headed for the valleys of Barbarus. Breaking through the poisonous mists, Mortarion discovered that the prey of the warlords were in fact the same species as he, and swore to deliver them from their oppression. The people of Barbarus were slow to accept this pale, gaunt stranger from the mountains, but Mortarion was given a chance to prove his worth when creatures enthralled to another warlord attacked the village. Seeing that the peasants were unable to effectively fight back, Mortarion joined the fray, wielding a massive harvesting scythe that made short work of the beasts. The warlord smiled when Mortarion advanced upon him and withdrew to the apparent safety of the deadly fog, only to be pursued and butchered by this inhumanly resilient Primarch. Accepted into the village without further reservation, Mortarion began to train the villagers in the art of warfare. Soon, representatives from other villages journeyed to learn from Mortarion, while the villages scattered across the valleys of the world were transformed into strong points. Mortarion traveled from settlement to settlement, teaching, building, and defending his people. He recruited the toughest, most resilient men he could find, forming them into small units that trained under his supervision. He enlisted the aid of blacksmiths, craftsmen, and artificers to create suits of armor that would allow men to travel through the poisonous fog. As each battle in the mists was fought, Mortarion and his Death Guard would learn how to better adapt the armor and themselves to reach the more poisonous heights. Eventually, only one peak denied them access, the one on which Mortarion's adoptive father had made his home. Despite his adoptive father being a ruthless necromancer, Mortarion felt reluctant to attack the man who took him in and called off the planned attack on the advice of Callus Typhon, who warned that he was not yet ready to face the High Overlord, even with the new suits of armor. Returning to the village, Mortarion's mood darkened when he found his people talking not of his victory, but of the arrival of a benevolent stranger who promised salvation to the people of Barbarus. Finding this stranger in conference with the village elders, Mortarion claimed that his people needed no outside help. The stranger commented that even Mortarion and his Death Guard were having trouble pacifying the final warlord and offered a challenge. If Mortarion could defeat the High Overlord Nikaea, the stranger would leave. If not, Mortarion had to swear fealty to the stranger and the Imperium of man he represented. Ignoring the protests of his Death Guard, Mortarion left alone to confront his adoptive father, motivated by a compulsion to prove himself to the stranger below. The confrontation was brief. The air surrounding the High Overlord's fortress was so poisonous and toxic that parts of Mortarion's armor began to rot away. He collapsed at the gates of the Overlord's citadel, bellowing challenges to Nikaea. The final thing Mortarion saw before he almost blacked out into unconsciousness was the Overlord of Barbarus coming to kill him and mocking him for his weakness and failure. At the same time, he heard a voice that was not his own within his head, seeking to make contact and impart what it called the true lesson about how to defeat death. Mortarion did not know it, but this voice was that of the Chaos God Nurgle, who had already chosen Mortarion to become his greatest mortal champion. But it was then, at the final moment before the High Overlord at last took the life of his wayward foster son, that the stranger suddenly appeared, leaping between the two and slaying Nikaea with a single thrust of his flaming sword. When he recovered, Mortarion swore fealty to the stranger as he had promised, who revealed himself to be Mortarion's true gene father, the Emperor of Mankind. The Emperor granted Mortarion command of the 14th Space Marine Legion, then known as the Dusk Raiders, who quickly adopted the name, iconography, and dogma of Mortarion's Death Guard. However, the Emperor's slaying of the primarch's adoptive father, the Emperor's denial of his final vengeance, of the proof that he was worthy, became a grudge Mortarion forever after held against him. It would coil within his heart like a rancid viper and provide the seed of weakness that the plague god Nurgle would later exploit. True to his oath, Mortarion bent his knee to his newfound father as soon as he was sufficiently recovered to do so, although his final act of defiance on Barbarus would leave scars upon him, both physical and mental, that would never fully heal. A skilled warlord in his own right, Mortarion was immediately given command of the 14th Legion of Astartes, which carried his genetic inheritance, and did so on his own terms. Gathering them before him, a grim and spectral figure robed and bearing the great black scythe that had once belonged to his nightmarish foster father. It must have seemed to the Terran-born Dusk Raiders that an ancient, graven image of the Grim Reaper had come before them as their new master. His words were simple and delivered in a harsh whisper that nevertheless carried to each and every one. "You are my unbroken blades. You are the Death Guard. By your hand shall justice be delivered, and doom shall stalk 1,000 worlds." The Legion's name was then changed in accordance with this decree, and Mortarion's words were engraved above the airlock door of the battle barge Reaper's scythe in honor of that moment. By this simple decree, the Dusk Raiders were no more, and the records and annals from that day forward would carry this new name as one to strike fear into the hearts of mankind's enemies. The 15th Legion's Astartes had been primarily Terran-born before Mortarion joined the Legion. After that time, almost all of the Legion's neophytes were drawn from the feral world of Barbarus. This changed the culture and traditions of the Legion, so much so that by the last days of the Great Crusade in the early 31st millennium, there were increasing tensions between the Barbarus-born Astartes and the Terran minority who remained in the Legion, and who remembered the Dusk Raiders' earlier martial traditions brought out of Old Terra. These tensions became most clear in the period directly preceding the First Battle of the Horus Heresy at Istvan Thr, when approximately 1/3 of the Legion was judged by Mortarion to be likely to remain loyal to the Emperor when the Legion joined the War Master Horus in his rebellion against the Imperium. Many of these loyalist Death Guard Astartes were Terran-born, former Dusk Raiders like Battle Captain Nathaniel Garrow of the 7th Great Company, whose loyalty to the Emperor outweighed their devotion to their primarch. In the solar decades that followed, the renamed Aphorinasaif Legion fought tirelessly in the service of the Great Crusade. Never relenting in battle beneath their primarch's gaze, they pursued the liberation of mankind with a fervor the Great Crusade had never known. Their restless fleet plowed the cold void from one campaign to the next, resupplying on the move, never pausing but to make war. The Death Guard did not garrison, they did not build. They only tore down and slew, coldly, determinedly, and with the inexorable progress of a contagion or a tsunami wave, and worlds fell before them. Over time, Mortarion shaped the creed and practice of the Death Guard, his beliefs in many ways forming a natural extension of their own, beliefs and doctrine becoming ever more refined and extreme. At the heart of them was the unshakable determination that mankind should be free of oppression and terror. Such freedom could only be won in the Primarch's mind by destroying those that would shackle and devour humanity. This was a war to be fought without mercy or limit, without restraint or relenting. The battle for the human future was one that could only be won by enduring any hardship, no matter how terrible, and not shirking from any act, no matter how savage in pursuit of victory. This single end, the liberation of humanity to Mortarion's creed, justified any means. Mortarion believed that victory in battle came through sheer resilience, and Horus, who used the strengths and weaknesses of the different legions to create the most efficient fighting force possible, used his legion in coordination with Mortarion's frequently. Mortarion and the Death Guard would draw out the enemy and tire them down, and then the Luna Wolves would strike. This combat tactic worked brilliantly, and Mortarion grew close to Horus. Mortarion was a grim and driven primarch, his breathing apparatus and scythe an inseparable component of his aspect. The pallid, hairless primarch was viewed by others as a freak, and was distant from all his brother primarchs save Horus the War Master and Conrad Kurz the Night Haunter, the leader of the Night Lord's Legion. Some primarchs, such as Robut Guilliman, feared that Mortarion was more loyal to Horus than he was to the Emperor. However, at that time, the Emperor claimed that loyalty to Horus was de facto loyalty to himself. Events would prove the Emperor sorely mistaken. Solar decades of endless battle changed the Death Guard, and over time the Terran influences on the Legion became less and less apparent, with the panoply and traditions of the Dusk Raiders and the Officio Militaris erased in favor of Barbarus's bleak creed of war. The bare, ivory-gray, unpainted ceramite that Mortarion favored for the Legion's power armor became increasingly less adorned, save for new murky jade markings set to echo the corrosive-resistant swamp mud applied to coat the iron plates of the human warriors that had once served the Primarch of Barbarus, and shorn of older heraldry and Terran influence. The martial stratifications of Old Earth's War Masters were done away with, too, and eventually the Uffertine-teamed Legion's Librarius was disbanded thanks to Mortarion's hatred of witchery, such as that the hated charnel masters of Barbarus had once wielded. Mortarion's hand and mind was at work everywhere, remaking his Legion, from changing tactical doctrines to equipment procurement, and some say, behind the selection of candidates and changing practices in the Legion's Apothecarion, where he gained the latter knowledge to interfere. With the prevailing conditions on Barbarus and the foul beings that more than likely still stalked the planet's fog-shrouded mountains and deep swamps, there were whispers that the human population that remained would have been better off if they had been euthanized or displaced to a cleaner world for the sake of the sanity of future generations. Mortarion would have none of this, for Barbarus now belonged to his people, bought and paid for by generations of blood and terror, and its strongest sons would now serve as recruits for his new Death Guard. As for the purely human Death Guard that had once fought for him against the overlords of Barbarus, many now became the masters of that world. A dread aristocracy they soon became, while the youngest and strongest, like Callus Typhon, took full or partial conversion into the Legiones Astartes, heedless of the high fatality rate that late induction carried with it. This was deemed a small enough price to pay to continue in the service of Mortarion, their savior. With new recruitment at issue, Barbarus itself, in a short span of Terran years, became little more than a factory of sorts to produce new recruits for the Death Guard Legion, and intake from other sources of recruitment to which the Legion had title dwindled to a mere handful, unless the pressure of fatalities in the field proved too great. Mortarion's resistance to the use of bloodstock other than that of Barbarus wavered only because of the need to keep his Legion's strength battle-worthy in his eyes. Recruitment solely from Barbarus was however aided by the high suitability of the planet's hardy feral population to the conversion process. The Legion's gene seed seemed to amplify the uncommon resistance to contagion and toxins in its Barbarus candidates to unheard-of levels. As fresh intakes of new Space Marines came in from Barbarus, the surviving core of Terran blood in the Koftin Team Legion became a minority as the Great Crusade burned on across the stars, the Death Guard at the forefront of the fighting in the most hellish war zones imaginable. Although second perhaps in their Gene Father's eyes, the Terran contingent remained stubborn in the ranks, hardened veterans and a force to be reckoned with in the Legion. Mortarion was present at the Council of Nikaea, where he spoke out against his brother, the Primarch Magnus the Red. Having witnessed during his youth on Barbarus the horrors produced by psychers and sorcery, he testified passionately against them, ending his plea with a dire warning against any use of sorcery by the servants of the Emperor. Unlike the other speakers at Nikaea who stood against the use of psychic powers, and who mostly harangued Magnus and reviled the Thousand Sons, but brought little proof or argument to the debate, Mortarion's intervention was short, impersonal, and to the point. It therefore made a great impact upon the opinion of the Emperor, and drove Magnus to defend the use of psychic abilities with more drive and passion than he had originally intended. Mortarion was pleased when the Emperor ruled that sorcery was to be forbidden, and even the Space Marine Legion's Librarius divisions would be disbanded. The librarians returned to the ranks of the line astartes and sworn to never use their powers again. When the War Master Horus turned to chaos, it did not require much effort to drag Mortarion and his legion down with him. Horus had been one of the few primarchs with whom Mortarion had felt comfortable, and as such, he showed more loyalty to the War Master during the Great Crusade than to the Emperor himself. In truth, Mortarion had never forgiven the Emperor for denying him the chance to earn his final vengeance against Nikaea. Horus, a master manipulator who knew what was in his brother's heart, revealed to Mortarion that he knew that the Emperor had dealt with the powers of the warp to gain the knowledge needed to create the primarchs. Already deeply angry with his father, it did not take much for Horus to push the idea upon his brother that the Emperor was in truth a sorcerer, not much different from the High Overlord Nikaea on Barbarus, Mortarion's hated adoptive father. Horus promised that if Mortarion joined his cause and supported his rebellion, they would cleanse the Imperium of the Emperor's taint and build a new regime free of their Gene Father's lies, manipulations, and deceit. In addition to this, the Death Guard's first captain, Callus Typhon, Mortarion's second-in-command, had long been a secret follower of the ruinous powers and eagerly manipulated the rest of the Death Guard into treading the path of damnation. Mortarion revealed his true colors during the scouring of Istvan III, when he willingly sent potentially loyalist elements of the Death Guard into Horus's trap. Once the astartes who remained loyal to the Emperor were purged, the Death Guard then fought alongside their traitor brethren during the Dropsite massacre on Istvan Fee. For much of the Great Crusade, the errant White Scars Legion under the command of the Primarch Jagatai Khan had remained noticeably absent from the current chain of events that were only now beginning to trickle into their fleet's astropathic choirs. As they interpreted the astropathic messages they received in a contradictory manner, they began to suspect that things were not right. It had begun in the Kondak system, right towards the end of the campaign against the Greenskins. The first inkling that all was not well. There had been no detail then, no authentication, just stray astropathic messages of dubious provenance. It should have been easy to dismiss, to put down to the warping power of the Imperium. But it had worn on the Khan, unraveling his sleep. Jagatai was next contacted by the Space Wolves Leman Russ, who had just returned from the Battle of Prospero and the assault against the Space Wolves' old rivals, the Thousand Sons Legion. The VI Legion's fleet had mustered at the Alaxes Nebula to lick its wounds after the recent campaign, when it was beset by the forces of the Alpha Legion. Although the Khan sympathized with the Space Wolves' predicament, he refused to get involved until he was able to sort out the conflicting and often contradictory astropathic messages he had received. Until he knew beyond a shadow of doubt who was ally and who was an enemy, he refused to choose sides. Wishing his brother the best of luck, Jagatai wished to seek his answers elsewhere. The White Scar's fleet made all haste towards Prospero, the recently ravaged homeworld of the Thousand Sons Legion. The Kagan ordered his legion to head for the source of the trouble, to find the architect of the chaos engulfing the Imperium. Yet, only one soul could see the warp as it truly was, and that was Magnus the Red, the only one of his brothers that Jagatai had ever truly trusted. If Magnus yet lived, then everything could be salvaged. If he was dead, then the Imperium was finished. Eventually, the Khan found the answers he sought in the crystal caves deep underground, beneath the destroyed Prosperine capital city of Tizca. When he made his way back to the surface of the planet, he next encountered an unexpected visitor. As the clouds above them began to glow, a vibrant shard of light speared down from the smog, crackling as it hit the stone below. The Terminators turned to face it, powering up their weapons. Jagatai told his bodyguard he had felt this new arrival's presence following them for a long time. He had been on the Khan's heels since Ulanor. At long last, he had finally caught up. The Khan ordered his warriors to stand down, for the stranger was beyond all of them. How could he not be? For his brother Mortarion, the Death Lord, primarch of the Death Guard Legion, had found them. Watching the ash settle and the residual snags of Etherburn ripple into nothing, 7 figures within the maelstrom emerged. 6 of them were legionaries. They were clad in pale, thick-slabbed Terminator armor and carried huge power scythes known as Man-Reapers. Their pauldrons were olive green, and the links between the plates were cold iron. They were massive, heavier set than the Khan's retinue, hunched at the shoulder and leaking pale green vapor from the last of the teleportation beams. These were members of Mortarion's elite bodyguard, the Death Shroud. Mortarion proceeded to explain the reason for his recent arrival. He told Jagatai that he had sought him out, for things had changed. Jagatai realized that his brother had come to persuade him to join the traitor's cause. The Khan observed him guardedly, for Mortarion had always been hard to read. He left his blade unsheathed, holding it loosely at his side. Observing the physical changes in his brother, he noticed that Mortarion's power seemed to have grown. Something burned in him, dark like old embers. His flesh was somehow bleaker, his stance a little more crabbed, and yet the aura of intimidation around him had been augmented. Back on Ulanor, even at the height of their triumph, he had not possessed quite the same heft. Jagatai commanded his brother to say what he had come to the ruins of Prospero to say. The Khan correctly surmised that Horus had not sent Mortarion. He had come of his own accord, with his own agenda. Mortarion brushed off the Khan's reasoning, but Jagatai pressed him. The Death Guard Primarch attempted to sway the Khan to Horus's cause, as Jagatai had surmised, to imagine a galaxy of warriors, of hunters, where the strong were given their freedom to act as they would, unbound by the Emperor's demands. The Khan was no fool, of course. This new galaxy would all be led by Horus. Mortarion merely shrugged. Horus would be the start of the new order. He was the champion, the sacrificial king. He might burn himself out to get to Terra, he might not. Either way, there would be room for others to rise to power over the galaxy to come. Mortarion told his brother that he should not have thrown in his lot with Sanguinius, let alone Magnus. He hated to see the 3 of them getting dragged in deeper by the Emperor's hypocrisy. Their father had tried to pretend that it was not there, the warp, as if he were not already up to his elbows in its soul-sucking filth. In Mortarion's opinion, it should have been cordoned off, put away, forgotten about forever by mankind. But the Khan was not fooled by his brother's sincerity. He had seen what had happened. The Death Lord had never hidden what he wanted. Jagatai could see how his brother thought it would all play out. First, hobble the sorcerers. Silence the witches. Drive them out, and rule would pass to the uncorrupted, the healthy, those untouched by the warp. This was Mortarion's great project. He had even told the Khan all of this on Alinor after the triumph. The Khan had thought back then that they were empty threats, but he should have known better. Mortarion did not make empty threats, but it had all gone wrong. Though Mortarion had completed his great mission, and the Emperor had handed down the edicts of Nikaea forbidding the use of sorcery and the disbandment of the Legion's librarius divisions, there were now more sorcerers than ever amongst the ranks of the traitors. Horus had sponsored them. Lorgar had shown them new tricks. If Magnus had not already made up his mind on which side of the conflict he would be on, then he soon would, and then Mortarion would be surrounded. He had destroyed the librarius of the legions, only to find witches were now untrammeled amongst the traitors. The Khan had seen the overall picture perfectly. Magnus's shade had showed him. Jagatai proceeded to warn his brother that though his legion might be free of the warp's corruption for now, the change would come, for Mortarion had made his pacts with the masters of the Imperium, and now they would come to collect their due. But this was exactly why Mortarion had come to find Jagatai. The Death Lord had run out of friends among the traitor primarchs. Who would stand with him against the Psykers now among the traitors? Most assuredly not their brother Angron, nor the half-mad Conrad Kurza. The Khan gazed at Mortarion disdainfully. His brother had tasted the fruits of treachery and found them bitter. The Khan did not wish to be dragged into his brother's ruin. Mortarion was on his own, struggling to contain his anger at the Khan's refusal of his pleas for alliance. The Death Lord warned Jagatai that he had come to give his brother a choice. Half of the White Scar's legion had already declared for Horus, and the others would follow wherever the Kagan ordered them. Their father's time was over. The Khan could either be a part of the new order that replaced him or be swept aside in its wake. The Khan merely smiled, a cold smile, imperious in its contempt. He would not countenance a new emperor, neither himself nor Mortarion. Jagatai explained that the reason neither one of them would ever rule the galaxy is that both of them were never the empire builders. They were the outriders. Mortarion had chafed at this role, while the Khan had embraced it. Enraged, Mortarion backed away, and his scythe silence crackled into life, sparking with green-tinged energy. The Death Shroud Terminators lowered their scythes in a combat posture. Behind the Khan, the Keshig readied their blades. The Khan prepared to settle their argument once and for all. The two primarchs circled one another, prepared to finally engage in a deadly duel that would decide their fates. As the two demigods battled, their respective retinues also fell onto one another in deadly close combat. The silent Death Shroud were just as implacable as their master, as they fought the White Scar's Keshig amidst the wreckage of a lost world. Warriors of both sides soon fell, their bodies caked in the thickness of blood and dust. But the dispute raged on, bitter and unyielding. The two primarchs traded deadly blows, tearing into one another, each strike powered by raw defiance. As they hacked and countered, neither giving up a single measure of ground, their blood mingled upon their blades' edges, as rich and dark as wine. Summoning up one last burst of energy, the Khan held position, panting hard as he dragged out the remnants of his power for the final clash. In response, Mortarion only stood, rigid, as though suddenly listening for something. His scythe fell into the guard position, and a thin coughing broke from his mask, which the Khan realized was an exhausted kind of chortle. So the choice has been made. The Death Lord informed Jagatai that their respective fleets in orbit of Prospero were now at war. This was not what they had been promised by the White Scar's treacherous warrior lodge brothers, but the Death Lord refused to lose a fleet for the sake of this fight. Feeling the dust stir around his feet, coils of marsh green teleportation energy rippled downward. Mortarion saluted the Khan mockingly, and spears of hard-edged light lanced down from above, bursting through the cloud cover and crashing through the heart of the ruined Tizca pyramid they had been fighting within. The Khan sprang forward, seeing too late what was happening. In an instant, the Death Lord and his retinue were snatched away, sucked into the vortex of the warp. The devastated world's wind howled in their empty wake, stirring the ashes of ruined Tizca. Jagatai, carried by the momentum of his final thrust, staggered through the empty space where his brother, now his enemy, had been. The second battle of Prospero was over. Chagrined by his defeat at the hands of Jagatai Khan, Mortarion abandoned the pursuit of the White Scars and instead led his death guard in a spiteful, punitive rampage across the systems of the lost Prosperine Empire. World after world soon fell to this horrific onslaught, and yet the insular and secretive Primarch seemed preoccupied by some other, unspoken goal. Finally, he found what he sought for upon the world of Terrathalion, a former library world where knowledge coalesced, all under the benign guidance of distant masters on Prospero. When his void ships emerged from the system's Mandeville Point in 007, M31, and spread out through the local system, they were not the sleek and gloriously decorated crimson-colored system runners of Magnus the Red's Axed Avth Legion, but corpse-gray, vast-hulled leviathans. Moreover, it was no mere squadron that had arrived, but an entire Death Guard battle group. Mortarion ordered the orbital bombardment immediately. When the bombardment finally relented, the few survivors crept slowly from whatever refuge they had been able to find. Thinking for a moment that the worst was finally over, they soon saw dirty contrails of drop pods split the smoke-barred skies. The entirety of the Death Guard Legion had come to the doomed world. Though still gravely wounded and in deep pain, the Death Lord teleported down to the surface, seeking a mortal woman. Upon her discovery, he had his captive teleported with him back aboard his flagship, the Endurance. Within his private quarters, he interrogated the woman, who in truth was a demon in possession of the woman's body. Mortarion had never encountered its kind before, believing his father, the Emperor, that such fell creatures did not exist. Now one of the denizens of the Imperium stood shackled before him. The Primarch sought answers from the demon. He wanted to know why his brothers Lorgar and Fulgrim willingly trafficked with the creature's kind. The demon explained that Mortarion's brothers had come to see the true order of things. Despite all that had occurred, Mortarion still believed that all sorcery was a cancer. He still believed that humanity must guard against it, push it back. After destroying an entire world in his search for answers, he yearned to know the truth about chaos. Mortarion knew that he was now surrounded by the damned. Jagatai had been right. The Death Lord was on his own with them. The warp stained everything, but he would endeavor to understand it, to overcome it. The demon's final task would be to show him how, but the foul creature laughed at Mortarion's efforts. Like thousands of other mortals the creature had encountered over the eons, each was convinced that they alone could find a way to negotiate with the gods of the warp with little to no consequence. The demon explained to the Primarch that the Imperium had many great forces within it, and one of them had Mortarion's name etched over his rusting throne. He was still waiting, though not for very much longer. It mattered not how many trinkets the Primarch rattled or waved. This power of the warp would not be denied. He had claimed Mortarion as his own champion. The Primarch was enraged at the creature's proclamation. Even his father, the Emperor, could not claim him, but Mortarion admitted that he was guilty of patricide long before the seeds of treachery were sown in the War Master Horus's heart. He had seen them all, the tyrants, the witches, the Xenos filth. Only he remained pure, free of the corruption wrought by the warp. But the demon could see through all of the Primarch's lies and self-delusions, and taunted him. He didn't look all that pure to her at all. The demon continued to taunt the Primarch, goading him. If he wanted to know the truth, then it would be revealed. The creature's bonds were suddenly shattered, and her human shell peeled away, revealing her glossy, insect-like true form. Though the Primarch's physical strength was enormous, The demon knew that it would not help him, for she was not a creature of real space, defined and constrained only by laws and powers that the Primarch feared to invoke. In an attempt to resist the demon's brutal attack, he tore at it with his hands, still relying on the immeasurable strength in his transhuman musculature. Enraged, Mortarion called upon his own innate psychic abilities that had always been buried deep down within him. The glorious stink of learned sorcery and hedge magic was now pungent and inescapable. The power of the warp was within him, and he was using it willingly, in spite of every one of his protestations. As the demon sagged back against the wall, feeling her soul pulled back to the Imperium by the Primarch's psychic might, Mortarion continued to hammer her furiously with his fists, pouring out all of his fury onto the broken physical shell. The demon was the first to see a fragment of what Mortarion would eventually become in later centuries. As the creature died, and her quintessential matter was sucked back into the maw of the ether, she managed a mock salute. "Hail, Master of the Plague!" Mortarion stood over the crushed heap of broken flesh, breathing heavily. For too long, he had been used by all sides in the great conflict. The void around him now seethed with witchery, more virulent than ever. He could feel its tendrils grasping for him. The Death Lord knew he would have to learn more. He would have to master all the paths of ruin. He would, as perhaps he had known but refused to believe for a long time, have to become the very thing that he had always hated, a psyker, a master of sorcery and the powers of the witch. A sorcerer just like his foster father on Barbarus. Mortarion made his peace with the truth, believing that it was better to be a master of the warp than its pawn. So be it, he thought to himself. It starts here. During the subsequent assault on Terra itself at the end of the Heresy by the traitor legions, the Death Guard were part of Horus's invasion force. However, en route, the entire Death Guard Legion fleet became trapped in the Imperium due to the actions of First Captain Callus Typhon, trapping them in a perpetual nightmare. It was whilst on campaign with the Word-Bearers Legion earlier in the Great Crusade that Typhon had learned of a different path for the Legiones Astartes to follow, a future where his hard-won but hidden psychic abilities would be a source of greatness instead of a taboo to be hidden from sight. The foremost chaplain of the Word-Bearers, Erebus, inducted Typhon into the secrets of the Seven-Pillared Lodge, one of the warrior lodges that had begun to spread throughout the Space Marine legions in the later days of the Great Crusade. It was during this time that Typhon caught a glimpse of what the Astartes could truly become if they shrugged off the yoke of the Emperor's ambitions. Perhaps Typhon's revelation was instrumental in Mortarion's own fall to the ruinous powers. Perhaps Mortarion would have walked a dark path on his own. Either way, the troubled Death Guard Primarch saw a worthy leader in Horus, whereas in the Emperor he saw only a self-serving and pompous pretender who had stolen Mortarion's hard-won kingship in a single day while engaging in hypocrisy concerning his own use of the warp. As the heresy reached its conclusion, Mortarion ordered his fleet to head for Terra with all haste, intending for the Death Guard to join the other traitor legions in the destruction of the false emperor. By this point, Callus Typhon served one master alone, and it was not his primarch. Typhon had seen to it that the fleet's navigators were killed to a man, claiming their loyalty was still to the emperor, but reassured Mortarion that the warp gift he possessed would see them through their journey in the Imperium safe enough. Though he hated the concept of relying on what he considered witchery, even in one of his own Astartes, Mortarion was left with little choice. The Death Guard fleet made transition into the warp, and in the process damned themselves to an eternity of war as the puppets of a foul and ancient god. In leading the Death Guard into the warp, Typhon had delivered them into the clutches of his new master, Nurgle, the Lord of Decay. The strange tides of the Imperium are notoriously fickle, and during their voyage the entire Death Guard fleet was becalmed within its shifting dimensional tides. As their warships lingered, directionless and without hope, the cloying influence of Grandfather Nurgle began to take hold. The Death Guard were subjected to the terrible infection of the Destroyer Plague and Nurgle's rot, as Nurgle's power managed to infiltrate the vessels of the Ufrii Nam Legion. It polluted the vessels themselves as easily as it did the transhuman warriors within. The virulent plagues infected the fleet while they drifted aimlessly through the warp, making a mockery of the Death Guard's legendary resistance to toxins and contagions. The plague that came could not be resisted, something that terrified Mortarion and the Death Guard. It transformed them into bloated mutants, yet none could die, their own body being their undoing. None suffered more than Mortarion, for it was like being on the mountaintop again on Barbarus, surrendering to the toxins, but this time without the Emperor to save him. Eventually, Mortarion could suffer no more and gave himself over to chaos to stop the pain. Desperate, Mortarion offered his legion and his own soul up to the ruinous powers in exchange for deliverance. Nurgle responded gleefully and took the FT Mafev Legion and Mortarion for his own champions. As Mortarion at last swore his soul to the eternal service of the Plague God in return for an end to the ceaseless agony, Nurgle responded with his usual generosity. Mortarion was transformed into a demon prince of the Plague Father, the living embodiment of life in death and death in life. The Death Lord at last was worthy of his title. What emerged from the warp bore little resemblance to what had gone in. The Death Guard Space Marines' once gleaming gray armor was corroded and shattered, barely containing their bloated, pustule-riddled bodies. Their weapons and armor were powered by the energies of chaos, and they became known as the Plague Marines, although they would still use the name of the Death Guard for themselves. Mortarion himself left his humanity far behind and was transformed into Nurgle's greatest mortal champion, the Prince of Decay, the very image of death. Condemned to a deathless state of decay, the Death Guard would spread their pestilent diseases the length and breadth of the galaxy for the greater glory of chaos. In the end, Horus was defeated by the Emperor, but unlike the other legions, who splintered and fled into the Eye of Terror, Mortarion's legion, now calling themselves the Plague Marines, made an orderly withdrawal, wave after wave of loyalists, breaking themselves on the legion. Mortarion led his forces, in an ordered formation, back to the Eye of Terror. Mortarion claimed the demon world, later known as the Plague Planet, as his new homeworld, and it proved to be an ideal base for launching attacks from out of the Eye of Terror into the physical universe. Mortarion had finally gotten what he wanted, a world of his own. He ruled over a toxic death world of poison, horror, and misery. For better or worse, the Death Lord had come home. Within the Eye of Terror, Mortarion was elevated to become a demon prince by Nurgle and given control of a demon world, now known as the Plague Planet, which he molded into a new and despicable form, making it a virtual copy of Barbarus, placing himself in his adoptive father's position as its chief tyrant. To this day, Mortarion's Death Guard launched their assaults through the Cadian Gate and into the galaxy beyond, sometimes in large bodies and at others lending strength to allied forces. Wherever they travel, they spread the joyful, exuberant poxes of Nurgle, gifting those who would know eternal life with the choicest of the Plague God's blessings. Typhon, now called Typhus the Traveler, took a more active role in continuing the war against the Imperium by abandoning his master and striking out on his own, bringing the gifts of his patron to the Emperor's followers. Typhus was especially active during the 13th Black Crusade, securing his own plague-ridden stronghold by the end of that conflict. In an ironic twist of fate, Mortarion has become exactly like the overlords of Barbarus he vowed to kill 10,000 years ago. He sat for millennia in a plague fortress atop a tall mountain surrounded by toxic clouds, just like the adoptive father he despised in centuries long since forgotten. Abaddon the Despoiler united the disparate factions of the Eye of Terror and unleashed the 13th Black Crusade to bring ruin to the world that had proven his nemesis for millennia. The fortress world of Cadia, which had long stood sentinel over the Cadian Gate, finally fell to the Despoiler during that campaign. The destruction of Cadia eliminated the mysterious geometric pylons that dotted the fortress world's windswept outlands, and in doing so weakened the barrier between worlds, for these ancient megaliths were fashioned to keep power of the warp from overwhelming the material dimension. The Despoiler's agents repeated the same act on every world that harbored similar structures. Without these linchpins to hold the material dimension sacrosanct, the Imperium could take no more, and a titanic warp rift tore across the galaxy, spreading from the Eye of Terror to the Hadex anomaly on the eastern fringe. To those on the Terran side of the so-called Great Rift, or the Cicatrix Maledictum in High Gothic, it is a tainted scar stretching across the sky. To those unfortunates on the far side, in the region now named the Imperium Nihilus, the Dark Imperium, it is something much worse, the very gates of hell. Though the Imperium now faced its darkest hour, all was not lost. A valiant band known as the Inari, a mixed faction of Aeldari and Drukhari in service to their awakened god of the dead Aeneid, followed a radical path that they believed would see chaos defeated and the Eldari race resurgent. Compelled by fate or circumstance, the Inari lent their aid to Archmagos Belisarius Cawl, Saint Celestine and Inquisitor Katarina Greyfax, and rescued them from the forces of Abaddon on Clysis, the ice moon of Kasr-Holn after the fall of Cadia. Together, the Inari and their newfound Imperial allies forged a path through their foes and the webway to Ultramar. Upon Macragge, the chapter homeworld of the Ultramarines, a miracle was wrought within the fortress of Hera through the technological prowess of Belisarius Cawl and the power of Ennead as embodied in his priestess Yvraine, the daughter of Shade. Robut Guilliman, primarch of the Ultramarines who had been trapped for 10,000 standard years in stasis, was restored to the realm of mankind. Deep within the noisome swamps of Nurgle's garden in the realm of chaos, a conclave of great unclean ones listened indulgently to the frantic babbling of messenger flies. They leered in delight, bile and maggots slopping down their festering chins. A primarch, one untouched and untainted by any of Nurgle's brothers. Their pestilential master would no doubt value such a prize most highly. Perhaps they chortled mockingly. They might even arrange a final reconciliation between the bitter Mortarion and his brother. Such an opportunity had not presented itself in thousands of years, and the great unclean ones hummed a cheerful ditty as they began to concoct a sickness fit for a demigod. Upon a far-flung hell world, Mortarion received word of his brother's awakening. Mortarion raged, a cold and virulent storm of anger whirling around him until its echoes in real space seeded 7 new and terrible plagues upon luckless imperial worlds. Mired amid plans that were nearing fruition, the demon primarch of the Death Guard could not yet act to strike at Guilliman. Instead, as he stared with glowing eyes across the mist-wreathed parade grounds of his plague planet and the massed ranks of Death Guard there assembled, Mortarion vowed that he would render Guilliman and his empire to rot soon enough. Something terrible came out of the warp storms as they roiled through the southern reaches of the Ultima Segmentum, where the seeds of corruption had been planted by the plague that walks. A new and terrible contamination spread. The diseased dead rose to claim the living. Previously, the walking corpses could be destroyed, but now doing so only released hordes of Nurglings that writhed impossibly out of the withered flesh of the fallen. Hive worlds were toppled, and as the blackness of the Noctis Aeterna descended, there was no escape. In the horrific ruins, cults of corruption slithered out of hiding, summoning forth further aid from the realm of chaos itself. So did systems fall, creating the Scourge Stars, a trio of sickly star systems that had fallen to Nurgle. From that power base, the Death Guard and demonic plague legions issued, systematically reaping planet after planet. The first invaders to issue forth from the Scourge Stars were the Death Guard, led by grim Mortarion, who now brought the fabled realm of Ultramar, gem of the whole segmentum, under siege. His meticulously planned 7-part campaign would bring untold ruination to all of Ultramar. So began the first part, the War of Flies, including the assault of the 3 planets, the besieging of the hive world of Ardium, and the creeping doom offensive against Espendor and Droll. Virus bombardments preceded the Death Guard. Once gloried hive cities became pits, and agri-worlds became fly-blown wastes. The attacks were slow but relentless, wearing down Ultramar's defending Ultramarines and their vaunted Ultramar Auxilia. With communications severed and relief forces cut off by fresh warp storms, the defenders were hard-pressed in 100 locations across Ultramar. Then Robout Guilliman returned from the end of the first phase of his galaxy-spanning Indomitus Crusade. Tactically, Mortarion and his fellow Nurglite commanders now found themselves evenly matched, their offensives blocked at every turn by the Ultramarines and their primarchs' precise counterattacks. A new stage of the war began. It was Guilliman's tactical acumen that first stabilized the many war fronts of Ultramar and his Spear of Espendor campaign, a brilliant counterattack that successfully bought the forces of the Imperium still more time. At the gates of Parmenio, Guilliman defeated the Greater Demon Septicus and his Plague Guard. At Iax, once a glorious garden world now transformed into a hospital world to tend to Ultramar's sick and dying, Primarch met Primarch as Guilliman confronted Mortarion, the two brothers fighting to a deadlock before the Chaos forces mysteriously withdrew under cover of a virus bomb assault that added to the myriad miseries of IAX.